12 men watched Jesus die. 11 of them, according to the records of the early church, were executed for refusing to say it ended there. Beheaded, crucified, speared, flayed alive. Scattered across 3 continents, from Rome to Persia to India. And not one of them, under torture, with their life on the line, ever recanted. Think about what that means. In the next 25 minutes, we're going to follow each of the 12 disciples, one by one, into the years after the Gospel's end, where they went, what they built, and how each of their stories ended. Some of what you'll hear comes straight from the Bible. Some comes from the earliest records of church history. And we'll be honest with you about which is which, because the truth here doesn't need exaggeration. And at the end, we'll confront the question their deaths force on every honest person, believer or skeptic. Because men will die for what they believe is true, but no one dies for what they know is a lie. First, you need to remember who these men were on the night Jesus was arrested. They ran. All of them. The Gospels, written by these very men's communities, record their own shame. Peter denied even knowing Jesus 3 times to a servant girl. After the crucifixion, John tells us they hid behind locked doors for fear of the authorities. These were not brave men. These were broken men. And then, 50 days later, those same men are standing in the open, in the middle of Jerusalem, in front of the same authorities, declaring that Jesus is alive. Something happened in between. The disciples said they knew exactly what it was. They had seen him, eaten with him, touched him. What follows is the price each of them paid for refusing to take it back. We start with the most famous of them all, the man who denied him. Simon Peter, the fisherman, the denier. After the resurrection, Peter becomes the unstoppable voice of the early church. His first sermon, recorded in Acts, converts 3,000 people in a single day. He's arrested, flogged, imprisoned, and Acts says he leaves the council rejoicing that he was counted worthy to suffer for the name. The man who once crumbled before a servant girl now couldn't be silenced by the Sanhedrin. Jesus himself had predicted how it would end. John 21. When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will lead you where you do not want to go. John adds, he said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Around AD 64, under the Emperor Nero's brutal persecution, Peter was condemned to crucifixion in Rome. And here, the early church historians record one of the most famous details in Christian history. Peter made one request: "Crucify me upside down. I am not worthy to die the way my Lord died." The denier became the rock. But Peter wasn't the first of the 12 to die. That grim honor belongs to the next name. James, brother of John, son of Zebedee, one of the inner 3 who saw the transfiguration. His death is the only one of the 12 recorded directly in the Bible itself. Acts chapter 12, verse 2. Short, brutal, unmistakable. King Herod had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword, beheaded. Around AD 44, barely a decade after the crucifixion, the first apostle to die for the testimony. And here's the detail that makes it sting. Years earlier, James and John had asked Jesus for the seats of honor at his right and left. Jesus asked them, "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" They said yes, not understanding. James understood now. Eusebius, the early church historian, preserves a tradition that the soldier guarding James was so moved by his testimony at trial that he converted on the spot and was beheaded with him. His brother John's story, though, could not have ended more differently. John, the beloved disciple, the youngest of the 12, he becomes a pillar of the church in Jerusalem, then later in Ephesus. He writes a gospel, 3 letters, and 1 apocalypse. Early tradition says Rome tried to execute him. Tertullian records he was thrown into boiling oil and came out unharmed. Whatever happened, Rome's next move is history. They exiled him to a barren island in the Aegean Sea called Patmos. And on that prison island, John received the vision that closes the entire Bible, the book of Revelation. Think about that. The empire silenced him on a rock in the sea, and from that rock came the most read vision of the future in human history. John is the only one of the 12 believed to have died a natural death, an old man in Ephesus around AD 100. Jerome records that at the very end, too weak to preach, John was carried into the church repeating one sentence over and over: "Little children, love one another." From the southern tip of Greece, we now go east, far east, because one of the 12 carried the message farther than anyone dreamed. Thomas, forever branded the doubter, the one who said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, I will not believe." 1 week later, Jesus stood in front of him and said, "Put your finger here." And Thomas fell to his knees with the highest declaration any disciple ever made: "My Lord and my God." Here's what most people miss. The man with the most famous doubts travelled the farthest of all 12 with the message. The consistent testimony of the early church and the unbroken tradition of millions of Indian Christians to this day is that Thomas sailed beyond the Roman Empire entirely to India, arriving on the Malabar coast around AD 52. The ancient churches he planted there still exist. They call themselves St. Thomas Christians, and they were worshipping Jesus in India for 1,500 years before European missionaries ever arrived. Tradition records Thomas was killed near modern Chennai, speared to death while praying on a hillside around AD 72. The hill still bears his name today, St. Thomas Mount. The doubter died 8,000 kilometers from home because he had seen something he couldn't unsee. Andrew, Peter's brother, the very first disciple Jesus called, and the man whose first recorded act was finding his brother and saying, "We have found the Messiah." After Pentecost, the records point him north to the regions around the Black Sea, Greece, and modern-day Ukraine and Turkey. He is still the patron saint of 3 nations he reached: Scotland, Russia, and Ukraine. In the Greek city of Patras, around AD 60, Andrew was condemned to crucifixion. Tradition holds he was bound, not nailed, to an X-shaped cross to prolong the dying, and that he preached to the crowds from that cross for 2 full days before he died. That X-shaped cross is on the flag of Scotland to this day. Most people have no idea they're looking at an instrument of execution. Philip, the disciple who asked Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father," carried the message into Phrygia in modern Turkey. The traditions of his death vary, but they agree on the city, Hierapolis, and that he died a martyr there. And here's where the story leaves legend and touches dirt. In 2011, archaeologists excavating Hierapolis announced they had uncovered a 1st-century tomb at the center of an ancient church complex, built to honor Philip. These were real men who died in real cities that you can visit today. Bartholomew, also called Nathanael, the man Jesus described at first sight as an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. The records take him in 2 directions: east with Thomas toward India, and north into Armenia. And it's in Armenia that his story ends, in one of the most horrifying martyrdoms of the 12. The tradition is unflinching. Bartholomew was flayed, skinned alive, and then beheaded. It's why, in Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, Bartholomew stands holding his own skin. And it's why Armenia became the first nation in history to officially adopt Christianity. They trace their church directly to him. Matthew, the tax collector, the collaborator with Rome, whom Jesus called from his collection booth with 2 words: "Follow me." He gave the world the gospel that bears his name, the bridge between the Old Testament and the New. After preaching to his own people in Judea, the traditions send him south, most consistently to Ethiopia, where he is honored as a martyr. The man who once took money from his people spent his life giving them something no one could tax. 4 names remain, and they include the most surprising transformation in the entire group. James, son of Alphaeus, called James the Less. We know almost nothing of his travels. The traditions place his ministry in Syria and Egypt, and his death by stoning or crucifixion. History forgot his journeys. Heaven didn't. Thaddeus, also called Jude, the man who asked Jesus at the Last Supper, "Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?" He got his answer by becoming part of how Jesus showed himself to the world. The traditions send him to Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia. And with him in Persia, Simon the Zealot. Stop on that name. A zealot, a member of the movement sworn to expel Rome by the sword. In any other story, Simon the Zealot and Matthew the Roman tax collector would have been mortal enemies. One killed collaborators, the other was one. Jesus put them on the same team, and it worked. Tradition holds Jude and Simon were martyred together in Persia around AD 65, killed by hostile priests. The Eastern churches still honor them on the same feast day. which leaves one name, the one everybody knows, the one who didn't make it to Pentecost. Judas Iscariot, the treasurer, the betrayer, 30 pieces of silver. Matthew records that when Judas saw Jesus condemned, he was seized with remorse. He threw the silver into the temple and went and hanged himself. Here's the contrast Scripture wants you to see, and it's one of the most important in the New Testament. 2 disciples catastrophically failed Jesus that night. Judas betrayed him, Peter denied him. One let his failure drive him to despair and death. The other let his failure drive him back to Jesus and became the rock of the church. The difference was never the size of the sin. It was where they carried it. In Acts chapter 1, the 11 cast lots to fill the empty seat, and a man named Matthias, a follower of Jesus since the beginning, becomes the 12th witness. Tradition holds he carried the message to the region of the Caspian Sea and died a martyr like the others. 12 seats, 12 stories. And now, the question all of this has been building toward. Here is the part of this story that makes everything else make sense. People die for false beliefs all the time. Every religion has martyrs. Sincere people die for sincere errors every century. But the disciples were not in that category, and here's the difference. Martyrs of every other faith die for what they were taught by others, something they believe second-hand. The disciples died for what they claimed to have seen with their own eyes, touched with their own hands. Which means for the disciples, and only for the disciples, there were exactly 2 possibilities. Either they saw the risen Jesus, or they knew with absolute certainty that they were lying. So picture it. Peter hanging upside down in Rome, Thomas facing the spears in India, Bartholomew under the knife in Armenia, each of them in different decades on different continents with no way to coordinate, each one offered the same simple exit. Just say it didn't happen. Not one of them said it. Liars make poor martyrs. A conspiracy of frightened fishermen does not survive 40 years of torture across 3 continents without a single defection. Something happened to these men, something they considered worth more than their lives. The empty tomb wasn't just their message, it was the one thing they refused to die without. If this gave you a new respect for 12 names you've heard your whole life, subscribe, because next week we go deeper into the Old Testament's greatest story, the complete story of King David. The shepherd boy who killed a giant, outran a king who hunted him for a decade, took a throne, committed the Bible's most famous sin, and was still called a man after God's own heart. His story is the most human one in the entire Bible. You don't want to miss it. 12 ordinary men, fishermen, a tax collector, a zealot. No armies, no money, no status. And the empire that executed them eventually bowed to the one they preached. Caesar has a past. These 12 have a future.